Hello, everyone. We are back with a new episode of The Journey Within. I am your host, Andrea Escobar Logreira, spiritual medium and psychic. Each week, we get to connect with different healers, storytellers, and vision holders as they walk us through their journey within, dark night of the soul experience, what inspired them to take a more spiritual journey and create light out of darkness. I feel so honored to be joined by today's guest, Joy Sullivan, the queer witch. I started following them on Instagram for their inspiring wisdom and insight. Anna provides Reiki, tarot card readings, spiritual coaching. I feel like just the presence is enough, and really bringing work of art into reality that is transformational. I'm so grateful to my lucky stars that we had the pleasure of connecting via Instagram, and today I get to hold space and dive deeper into your journey. So thank you so much, Anna, for joining us today, sharing your time, wisdom, and energy with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share more.
Yes, I'm so excited. So before we jump in and like really go back to your childhood and all of that, why don't you just share with everyone where you're at right now? I know we were talking right before we started recording that you're about to start this rebranding process, which I think is so amazing. Yeah, just kind of share with everyone where you're at right now.
Yeah, so I'm fresh into my Saturn return. I just started my Saturn return this year. So that can kind of like give you some context in terms of what's happening for me. My brand identity, the queer witch, is something I'm evolving right now, mainly because for business purposes, I realized that using a collective identity like the queer witch as a brand title just doesn't make sense from a business perspective because it's not trademarkable. And also because I want to just open things up a little bit more to share more about different experiences and expertise that I have that aren't specifically underneath the umbrella of queer witchcraft. Although, as a queer witch, I personally think everything I do is queer witchcraft. But yeah, so I am, I've always actually, before I was ever a witch or a business owner, I wanted to be a writer. And in particular, I've always been really into memoir and creative nonfiction writing. So this is actually going to be some of what I'm starting to produce for my audience. So that's one of the reasons why I think that this conversation, I'm so excited for it.
Oh, I'm so excited. So pumped. I have I want to go back to where my questions were, but right now, just on that, you're in your Saturn return. Do you want to share with us what your sun sign, moon, and rising are?
Yeah. So I'm a Cancer sun, Gemini moon, and Capricorn rising.
Oh my gosh. The only thing you're missing is like some fire, because you have all the elements covered so beautifully.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, my chart is actually pretty much, I don't have many planets in fire signs. The only one I really have is Chiron in Leo. So it
Interesting.
definitely comes through.
Ooh. Oh man, that's so interesting. Well, what's funny is my Gemini sun is going to play with your Gemini moon today very much. So that'll be amazing. Wow. Do you know where your North Node and South Node are?
Yeah, so my North Node is in Sagittarius and my South Node, so another fire sign, and my South Node is in Gemini, where I also have my Venus.
Wow. No, that North Node. So my moon and my rising are in Sag. But I'm intrigued with this because it really goes, now that you're talking about Saturn return, kind of stepping more into that, it really plays with what you were describing of kind of tapping more into that writing role, and Sagittarius being that philosopher, exploratory, kind of with your moon in Gemini. Man, I can't wait to see what happens in like 5 years. Just like, I'm going to be like, oh my God, you're totally in your North Node living that.
Yes, I actually have been feeling since my Saturn return started that I have had much more access to my North Node energy.
That is so beautiful. That's so, so, so beautiful. And one of the reasons why I'm so excited to talk to you today is that I feel like sometimes, especially in a world where we identify so much with what we do or who we are for a living, and in this new age of now, like, what we can do now isn't something that our parents could have done, 30 years ago, because they didn't have the internet that lets you kind of camouflage and go with where you want to go next. But with that, it's also people get so attached to you and your audience, you and your clients get so attached to the identity that you come up with first, that taking that leap to rebranding, there's a lot of inner trust that you have to have. And going back to with what you were saying of, on a business standpoint, not necessarily going under queer witch, but it is that, like, it's so in tuned with that, though, if you really like break it down and you take off the labels, because you being able to trust in this just shows how much you're in tune with all different aspects of yourself. So I just wanted to just kind of like note that it's so beautiful that you're saying that you're doing this, and it gives people almost an invitation to do the same. So thank you.
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, that's my Sagittarius North node, is like, I'm not like moving on from the queer witch because it hasn't been successful or because I haven't enjoyed it. I'm moving on from it because I know that there's more for me to do. And I'm like always about kind of getting out while you're ahead, if that makes sense. Like, because there definitely is a part of me that is attached to the queer witch, and that is like, will I be successful under any other name? Like, what if this is what the people are here for and they're not here for me? But part of my healing journey with the Chiron and Leo has been to actually realize that my community is showing up for me and my content and my evolving identity. And so I feel actually responsibility to continue to be forthright and authentic about what is top of mind for me.
Ooh, so, so beautiful. Thank you for that. So beautiful. So, with that, do you want to take us back to your childhood? Following your journey, I know that it wasn't the most nurturing to where you're at now, but also knowing that you truly believe that everything happens for a reason, and takes us to where we're needing to go. I know that you did decide to pick that childhood in this reincarnation period, but I would love to dive deeper into that.
Yeah, that actually is part of my personal spiritual worldview, is that like our souls have a lot of choice when it comes to the types of lessons that we not only want to learn, but also that we want to teach in a given lifetime. Although, of course, I understand that it's not for everyone. But for me personally, I do align with that. And I would say that, if you want to talk about like some of the lessons that I dealt with in my childhood, so much of it had to do with um, well, I'll just say, first of all, that I came into this world as a very theatrical child. That was actually my first passion, was like music and theater and being on stage. And I also, at the same time, experienced so much um, unwanted and unsupportive um, projections from my caregivers around my identity, and especially how to use my creativity and my image. And in particular, I think that this is something probably a lot of women and femmes and folks who were assigned female at birth out there could resonate with, which is that I was raised to believe that my job was to find a husband who could provide for me. And I was raised to believe that to do that job, I needed to be pretty and I needed to be perfect. And not only physically, but also like I could not have needs, I could not have upsetting emotions. And I certainly certainly couldn't be queer or anti-capitalist or in any way subversive. And so I struggled a lot with this kind of this simultaneous rejection of my creativity and authenticity, but then also this celebration of my physical beauty and the ways that my creativity were beneficial to my family, like receiving positive attention for my accolades, for instance. And a lot of my recovery journey has been removing a lot of the shame that I feel for what I'm interested in as a person, and also divorcing my sense of worth from cis heteronormativity. But there's also so much else that went on in my childhood. So that, I guess, is kind of, for me personally, where I'm at with my healing journey. And as a witch and astrologer, I do see like authenticity, creativity, and like being put on stage as a big aspect of my childhood.
Wow. Thank you for that. It shows where you've been able to kind of grow and almost heal. I feel like in order to be so self-aware, you do need to do a big chunk of healing. If not, we can't look at our shit. We're just like, da, 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 da. Everyone else is messed up. I'm great. So,
but I figured it out. So,
yeah, to be able to have that self-awareness is so beautiful. I have a question, and this is selfishly for me, but I'm sure a lot of people will relate with this. How did you, you were talking about theatrical a lot, and as a child, I was told very much that I was just like, I want a lot of attention. Look at me, pay attention to me. Just like everywhere I went, I was just constantly trying to do something to get adults to look at me. And I don't remember, but my mom tells me, she's like, there was a time where it was very, you enjoyed it, but then it did shift into more of you were looking for validation. And now I'm stepping back into that place of allowing myself to be seen. But I don't think I've allowed myself to be seen since I was like 5. So there's a lot. So for me, it's more of you loved that attention, but then you went through an entire process of detaching from so much. How were you able to step back into a place where you're like, I am safe to be seen? You know, because that comes from inside. Yeah.
No, because it's completely accurate. Like by the time I hit like age 10 or 11, I was like, I had stage fright. I stopped auditioning for anything. And it wasn't until I was in my early 20s that, so for me, I guess this is like, I'll wonder how satisfying of an answer is this, but for me, I actually found my way back into performing and being on stage through music once I got into college. And I'm not sure why necessarily that I felt safe. I think it had to do with, honestly with finding peers who were into the same things I was into. Because once I got into college, I met a lot of friends who were like wanted to talk about literature and nonfiction, and I had friends who were in theater, and one thing that I've always been really interested in is like the intersection between reality and fiction. And so my theater friends and I were able to see eye on eye to that, in the sense that we both saw life as a storytelling possibility. So once that kind of, I started to have like more of a community, because I went to an art school, Emerson College in Boston, and there was just a lot of art kids and queer kids there. So I think once I was surrounded and felt like I was being validated for the authentic creative urges that I had, that's when I started to put some of my energy back on stage. Yeah.
No, that I feel like it does. It is a satisfying answer. shows how much community really makes a difference when we have a supporting community around us and when we don't.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because, you know, you ask people 2020 their experience, and I'm not diving into any, I'm just talking about like their experience for 2020. And some people will say, oh my God, it sucked, but it was super transformational. And other people are like, oh, I hated it. It was the longest year of my life. And I'm like, interesting how you can have two different parallels and, you know, it was the same experience. But if you were surrounded by people that were constantly like, you know, like, I'm gonna dive deeper into my shit and I'm gonna let this break me, then chances are you're gonna have a similar response. But if you were constantly surrounded with people that were just like, this sucks, the world sucks, everything's ending, then that's gonna be your experience. So I do think that is a very, very important part of a lot of people's journeys. You hear about how much community made a difference.
Mhm.
Do you
Yeah.
feel like you've been able to grow with each community? Or sometimes it's just kind of like, hey, you had your role in my life, it's time to kind of end this
Oh, that's a
chapter?
great question. I would say that, I mean, yes and no. It's like I definitely can look back on like different avenues that I have found as a young adult to express myself. And I can see some that I still resonate with, whereas others I'm like, no, I would never do that again. So, but then in terms of the community, I can look back and see like certain contacts that I've made at different avenues of my creative development, but then also and this is something that's been happening to me a lot during my Saturn return, is I can also look back at specific communities that I've been a part of, and see really problematic shit in retrospect, basically. Oh, sorry, I don't know if you want me to
Oh
swear.
yeah, sailor's mouth. I'm already like dropping all the words.
Um, yeah, so it's difficult because it's like I do, and I've always been this way. Like in high school, I always like had friends from all the different friend groups, but I
Mhm.
wasn't like in any of them exclusively. And then as an adult, I feel like I've gathered experience and perspective that's been valuable to me in different communities that I've been a part of, but I'm also able to like separate. And once I realize that something is either no longer serving me or that it was an illusion, that was a lie, I try to move on from it as fast as I can. And this is something that I get better at as an adult. So yeah, so if that answers your question, I think sometimes you do have to transcend things, and it doesn't mean that you didn't value it previously. I know right now this is a huge collective experience right now where so many people are seeing red flags in retrospect to creators or communities or leaders that they've been part of or followed. And there's a really important sense of like need to protect the wisdom and the techniques or tools that we may have gained from that community that we still use today. And I believe that it's possible to do that while also like not enabling something that is harmful or that is taking away from your recovery.
No, that's beautiful and so reflective, and it shows just how much you've grown, um, because you're able to kind of say that. And I for me, it's interesting because when I was younger, I can identify with being friends with everyone, but I was like, everyone come get together, let's all be friends. And I struggled with a lot with realizing that not everyone is meant
Yeah.
to come together.
Mm-hmm.
And now that you're talking about Saturn return, I just came out of my Saturn return. So the lesson finally hit me where I'm like, okay, not every single person in my life needs to vibe with every single person in my life.
Yeah,
And it's been an interesting lesson. It's been an interesting lesson.
it really is, because like at the end of the day, everyone's just a representative of themselves. I was just thinking about this earlier today. I was like, you know that phrase that's like the enemy of the enemy is also my friend or something. I'm like,
Yeah.
the enemy of my enemy could be my enemy, and their enemy could, be, you know what I'm saying? It's like, or I could, because I always find like that the second I find someone who's saying something that I've always thought, and I'm like, wow, someone else actually feels this way, then like 3 weeks later, they say something that I completely disagree with. And this has just been, I've just been seeing it more and more. And I think that a lot of us are developing more of a capacity to like parse out our boundaries essentially around like, here's what I can tolerate in a friendship and here's what's not okay.
That it's for me, I've always had very polarized views than the people around me, even from like a very young age. It's funny because my mom and I were talking about this yesterday. I remember getting obsessed and just being like, I don't understand why, when I was younger, why do we have to pay for stuff? It would be so much easier if money didn't exist. And my mom's trying to explain to me as an 8-year-old why money makes sense. And I look at her, I'm like, you adults are just not smart. Like, how is it that I can figure this out and you guys can't? And she was telling me, she's like, even as a little kid, you saw things from a very different like bird eye view. Literally, you were just kind of like in a different plane. And last year I got in a lot of trouble for saying things that weren't accepted by a lot of people, and I had a lot of friends drop out of that. Um but I was also, one thing that I learned was, I'm like, just because I'm sharing my truth doesn't mean you need to agree with me,
Mm-hmm.
but you do need to respect what I'm saying, just like I'm respecting your point of view. Now, if we can't both come together and share our truth and be okay with that, then that's letting me know that we can't be, like, we're not in a place to be friends. And what I've had to learn is, it's not about them being right and me being wrong, or them being wrong and me being right. It's more of, and putting on labels, I'm throwing this on my Sagittarius moon. And going back to being a Gemini, I can see both sides to everything. So to me, having to pick one way of looking at things, I'm like, oh my God, that's so, like, I literally can't breathe thinking that I have to choose of
Yeah.
one way. But that's not going to be respected by someone that's like ultra earth and grounded. They're going to be like, no, it's this way. And it's like, no. So coming to terms with that has been really freeing, of just recognizing that I can learn from a lot from this, but I can also say, hey, it's okay to walk away and not
Mm-hmm.
turn it into something dirty or bad. Like, an ending doesn't have to be bad, is
Yeah.
it's kind of what I've learned. An ending doesn't have to be negative. An ending can be beautiful and welcoming, and just let us know that it's our time to move on and into to new territory.
And like, wouldn't you rather know than just be like clinging on to something that's not working because of the sake of tradition? And I also, I, as a Gemini moon and
Yeah.
Venus, I've always, like, in particular, been able to deeply empathize with people where they're coming from, even if I disagree with their viewpoints, or even if I am identifying harm that they're causing in their behavior. I still tend to have the capacity to understand, emotionally speaking, what type of context would lead a person to like adopt certain beliefs. And when it comes to like as well living on the internet, the amount of information that I learn regularly is like, I'm constantly reevaluating my beliefs because I am always learning new things. And especially with acknowledging the fact that most of our systems of information previous to the internet were colonialist systems. It makes sense why I would constantly be learning new things about our world, the way it works, and who benefits from the ways, from these things. And so, whenever I get into a situation where like I feel like someone is trying to like convince me that they're right, I'm
Yeah.
not really interested in it, because it's like they're trying to convince themselves that they're right at the end of the day. And where I like to come from it is more so that, like, I'm still figuring this out, and here's my current views on the situation based on the information that I found, but I'm open to learning more. And that's been really helpful for me, not only to like avoid looking like an ass on the internet, because
Yeah.
there was a time in my early 20s when, like I said, when I was getting into like punk music and performing hip hop music, where I was like really and this was a big shadow aspect of me, but I was like really digging into this part of myself that would be like, fuck the haters, and like I'm just gonna say what I want to say, and like, you know, like whatever. But I did get into situations where I made claims that I had no business making based on very little evidence, because I was like responding from a place of honestly emotional trauma. And I just didn't have the tools or support at the time to understand why it felt so important for me to protect this worldview or this truth that I had adopted. And so at this point, I'm also very like, if I see someone like talking to like non-existent haters and like um you know, almost like enticing opposition and like engaging in conflict for conflict's sake, I'm also not interested in that either, because that's not what I'm here for. I'm here straight up to make sure like that, like hmm, that we're all okay, you know, and that people can be happy and that we can be good. And to me, um, you know, bigotry and closed-mindedness is not, it's antithetical to community-based healing.
Ooh, you got me thinking there with a lot. So it's funny that you're saying that you in your early 20s experience a lot of just that almost reacting from an emotional trauma place, because it's not, we can't respond from our trauma, we can only react from it, you know.
Mhm.
It's such a interesting paradox. I was ultra triggered recently, like a few months ago, with everyone posting, I got a vaccine. And I'm like, why am I so triggered? Why do I care what they're doing? Like, this isn't a thing. And I had to examine
Yes.
what trauma, like wound, was getting activated. And when I looked deeper, it had to do with my own like healing journey when I gave my power away to doctors. So now seeing all of this, I'm like, I kind of had to take a step back and realize, okay, this is not your narrative playing out again. Um, you have to also recognize that just like you were in a state of flight or flight and you were just like, all right, tell me what to
Yes.
do. So is everyone else. Take a step back and listen. And when I
Hmm.
was able to shift into that, the conversations around COVID and the vaccine have totally changed, because now I can literally hear the most opposing view. And I'm just like, yeah, no, I totally see where you're coming from. Like, I can tap into that Gemini empathy that I was
Hmm.
blocked from because I was so in my own shit that I couldn't even see everything else.
Yes.
So it's beautiful that you brought this up. And have you recognized other things like that coming up for you, where you're
Oh,
able to?
totally. I mean, especially with like divisive issues, and whenever like my friends or someone who I trust am involved with is involved in a divisive issue, whether I even know how I stand on that issue, I tend to get a little, it's like, it seems to me like almost any divisive issue is divisive because it's triggering to a lot of people. And so it's like triggering to me. And I mean, let me just like, so I'll share something that I
Yeah.
recently went through. And this is actually also kind of about my rebrand too. Before I decided to step more fully into my personal brand, I was actually going through a period of time where I felt unworthy of even having a brand, and I was considering closing my business altogether because of the discourse. And I don't want to get into it too much because I know it's like very divisive, but a lot of the discourse surrounding quote unquote cancel culture and the way that anti-white supremacist and pro-Black life uprising was happening in June. I know I'm not the only person who went through this, but I was going through a lot of shame and feeling like because I had acted in racist ways previously, and in other bigoted ways previously, like, you know, as I mentioned, in my 20s, I was not always behaving appropriately. And I can absolutely recognize and see that. And I started to take every every little diatribe about accountability and justice and survivorship like a personal commentary on my behavior, and to the point where I was, like I said, ready to revoke my work essentially on the internet. And it wasn't until I first of all um got back on my meds, because that was a thing that was happening to me. And second of all, asked, like, why does this scare me so bad? And what are the parts of me that are afraid of being seen for their harmful behavior and the fact that, you know, we're not perfect people? And when I say we, I'm referring to internal family systems, which is a therapeutic model that I use that with my therapist, that is basically like we have multiple inner children and they all kind of want conflicting things. So I had to really figure out who's this inner child who feels so ashamed for having hurt people or potentially hurt people. And it wasn't until I could privately, and I say privately because it's really important, I think, that this type of process happens in private with a therapist or someone else who has the training and also is being like compensated for this work. But I privately was able to understand this little part of myself who felt like they had hurt people and that there were consequences coming. And when I was able to hold compassion for that part, I was also able to remember times where I was a really little kid where I was blamed for the harm that other people who were adults caused through their neglect, and that I had internalized that to a really strong degree that I was not even aware of. And once I discovered that there was a little really upset child who didn't think that they did anything wrong, but was told that they were malicious and hurtful, who was responding to all of this discussion around accountability and social justice like a 3-year-old would, like a 3-year-old who was in trouble for something they didn't know why they did. And once I identified that and I was able to bring it to therapy and validate that part of myself, I would say like most of the shame just kind of vanished. And not only did that shame vanish, but I was able to understand that moving on from branding myself as the queer witch was the right choice. I also came to some realizations surrounding some of my personal relationships with my family members and what types of boundaries I needed there. And now I'm in a place where I actually feel like I can, like, even talking to you about this, to be honest, is really edgy for me. And I probably wouldn't be so forthright like 2 weeks ago or a month ago. And it's a result of this work that I did really in the last 6 months to try to understand, why am I taking this so personally when it has nothing to do with, because I could clearly see this has nothing to do with me. Like, nobody's in my inbox or telling me I've done something wrong. And yet every time I see a major celebrity, usually a white cis man, being all of the harmful shit they've brought forward, I'm identifying with them. And I could very clearly see that this was a psychological and shadow-based situation, and it was. And now I can keep using my energy and my voice and my platform for the things that I care about rather than hiding.
Thank you for being so vulnerable right now and sharing that with us. I think that's gonna allow a lot of people to not feel so much shame with whatever arose. As you said, it was a very activating time and everyone handled it very differently. And I think it's important that we talk about this when we're ready. And I'm saying when we're ready because a lot of the time we think we owe it to the public to discuss certain things. And it's like, no, if you're not ready to talk about something, you don't have to put yourself in that space. But thank you for sharing that with us, because I'm sure a lot of people had a lot of mixed emotions. And kind of with what you were saying, I had a lot of shame come up too. And I had some issues with that because I'm like, I'm Hispanic. My grandpa's Black. Why am I feeling shameful over this? But what I had to kind of dive down deeper was I grew up hearing a lot of racial slurs, and it wasn't directed at brown or Black people. It was just more of like, if you want to have a good life, you gotta live like a white person. Like, it was very pushed into me, and that's very derogatory because I suppressed a lot of my own aspects to come off whiter and to come off more American and to fit in more. And this was something I still like remember, and it came up again last year when I was in, I think, first or second grade. There was this girl, and she had blonde hair, and she had like the pigtails with the curls that just like were really pretty, like the ones you saw on TV with the Brady Bunch, typical blonde American little girl. And I wanted to color with her so badly, but I didn't color in the lines because to me it didn't make sense. And she did. And when I asked her to color with her, she said no. She said, "You don't color pretty." And when you're little, you take that on like, oh my God, you don't want to be my friend. And to me, it didn't represent just the coloring. It represented, we're so different. My hair doesn't look as pretty as you. And I remember trying, like begging my mom to put pigtails on, to make the hair like that. And she's like, baby, but your hair's just not like that. Like, I can't force your hair to turn into something else. And it wasn't until I started talking to people about it when I was ready that I realized there was a lot of trauma that I hadn't dealt with, and it was being projected right now through the world. And the way that I view it, again, if you're ready to see this, I was being mirrored everything that I wasn't recognizing within myself. And the fact that I was getting, and I'm sure that maybe you can identify with this, that you were getting so triggered by a white man saying all of this. It's like, okay, why is this triggering me? I don't identify as you. So why am I getting so activated like this? And it's diving deeper when it's like, you were kind of saying you were taught to take on the responsibility for other people's actions. You know, a lot of kids, I feel like, were put in that situation and they don't recognize it as adults until it's like, why do I feel constantly responsible for everyone else's actions? And that was something that I had to kind of take a step back, and I'm like, I'm one person. I can't wipe off the wrongs of everyone I've come into contact with. That is their responsibility. I can only grow and decide to move on and show up differently. But it's a lot. There's a lot going on, especially when this isn't just internally, it's literally being magnified everywhere. So you're like, do like, where do I go? So thank you for sharing that, and being so vulnerable. I can't imagine honestly going through that. I took a step back from Instagram last year because I was just like, I can't share this. I'm still working through it. I can't share it.
Yeah.
So it's amazing that you were still able to show up on your platform.
Yeah, I'm surprised that I was able to, and a big reason why is because I was lucky and privileged enough to be able to actually hire team members um, in July. So I was able to withdraw a bit from being available and also consuming a lot of what is on social media. And I really spent that time focusing on like really focusing on my recovery. And I would say that it was not the first time, but the most recent time that I made the commitment to center my recovery in everything, because when I say recovery, what I mean is personal accountability and responsibility, and saying, I am going to take control of what I have control over, which is my choices, how I respond to what happens to me, and how I use my resources, rather than deflecting the blame onto other people. And a big part of that framework for me comes from, and while I personally have not had good experiences with all 12-step groups,
Yeah.
and I don't necessarily recommend AA for everyone, I was personally extremely benefited from a program called Al-Anon, which is, yeah, because you were saying some stuff that sounded kind of like that to me, which I had to go to because unfortunately I came from a family of alcoholics, and like alcoholics, some of whom are severe. And um, as I became an adult, the severity of some of their situations became so extreme that I was forced to go seek help. And I am so grateful for that, because I would never have understood that my responsibility is over myself, and that when I have the types of urges to get involved in other people's lives when I'm not invited, that's coming from the type of conditioning that I received from being raised as an enabler, essentially. From things from like having, like, I've had a lot of experiences with martyrdom, and like feeling like I can't say no to helping someone because I have been raised to always be helpful, and that has ended up with me looking like an ass on the internet. And I've also had to deal with the fact that in like with my clients and with my community, I can't be responsible for every member of the community and what they have to say and their views and opinions. So I think that everyone could benefit from that type of work, especially the work of like understanding who you can control and who you can't control, because even if not everyone is raised in an explicitly alcoholic home, we're all raised in a dysfunctional society, and that's what that type of work is for.
My parents neither are alcoholics, but my mom, my grandpa was when my mom was growing up, and she also lost her mom when she was 9. So I feel like, and this is something that I had to recognize and not, it's not even shaming her. It's just an observation. And now we can talk about it without it coming off like I'm judging her or criticizing her. But I'm like, you didn't have parents, you didn't have caretakers. So you compensated what you didn't receive. And then on one end, my father was completely emotionally unavailable, was literally like a child himself. And he put a lot of, like, the way that I viewed it was, you behave bad, so now I have to like put you in line, but I'm sick, so I don't know how I'm gonna do that. So I took on this very role of I am in charge. And I had stepped away from like unsolicited advice and getting involved into people's shit. But something that I realized, and that you kind of touched on, was I struggled with that with clients when I started doing readings, where I was doing readings for friends long before to build that trust muscle, but I had zero attachment with what they did. I'm like, you can do whatever the hell you want, I don't care. But now I'm like, why aren't you listening? Stop. And I clearly remember this one reading where I heard my guide saying, why are you getting attached to human needs and behaviors and conditioning right now? And I'm like, no, what are you talking about? Like arguing with them as this is going, and they're like, you are literally arguing with her. You're not relaying information. That's not what you're meant to do. You're meant to channel information and relay it. You're getting caught up in your human qualities and arguing with this woman, and you shouldn't. And I had to kind of like stop and say, hey, I'm going to end this and reach out to you tomorrow to do a new reading. And I had to own it and apologize and be like, I was so in my shadow because I reverted to being a little kid and being like, why aren't you listening? I know what you're supposed to do. And it was this weird thing because I wasn't talking to her as an adult. I was literally talking to her as a 6-year-old. Like,
Yeah.
So it's a crazy journey. You talk a lot about boundaries. What has been your what has been your journey with boundaries? There's a lot of it's selfish to set boundaries. It's this. There's a lot of different extremes, and the way that I view it is boundaries are protecting me. It's not about you. It's truly about me. And if it triggers you, then it has more to do with your lack of boundaries than my implementing of them.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's super accurate. I would say my journeys with boundaries are that I didn't have them for most of my life. Like, I just had zero boundaries whatsoever. The only type of boundary that I could do was like if someone hurt me enough, I would just completely cut them out of my life. And I didn't even really develop that boundary until my 20s. So, um, I think that as I aged, I started to see this repeated pattern of people, me becoming really, really close to someone who I just met, who was like really into me and like loved me and was like all about everything I did. And then it would very quickly turn into a relationship where I was like emotionally caretaking them, doing a lot of labor for them, like guiding them through life and holding their hand. And then they would make a move on me, which I would reject. And then I would say, I'm sorry, I thought we were friends. And then they would say, I don't know what you're talking about. We're just friends. I'm sorry if you misinterpreted that. And then I would cut them off. And this happened like too many times to the point where I can spill it out like that so quickly. And that's when I was like, maybe the common denominator here is me. Like, fool me once, shame on you, or whatever, but like fool me twice, shame on me. And that's when I realized that like I had a part to play in this, in the sense that like I would make myself super available to people. I had a lifelong tendency of kind of like changing up my interests and beliefs to suit people who liked me and who were interested in me. And I would say that's when I kind of started developing boundaries. And it's been a really long process. I think that my boundaries were really, really improved when I stopped drinking alcohol, and when I stopped abusing alcohol, I should say, because I was like starting to find like I basically alcohol was a tool for me to check out of my own boundaries, because it was like, how am I going to know that I'm not okay with something but then still do it because I don't feel strong enough to say no? And so I would use alcohol as a way to do something I didn't want to do but not have to feel it. And once I stopped drinking, I didn't have that tool anymore, and all of a sudden I was like, I'm not okay with 80% of this. Stop, please stop. And it was difficult, and I definitely had conflicts with my loved ones about it. There's some conflicts I'm still in with my loved ones, but at this point, with the relationship that I've been able to develop with my own just genuine sense of safety or lack of safety around people, behaviors, organizations, institutions, I have pretty flexible and intuitive boundaries at this point, to where I start to see boundaries less as like a wall as I first did, and more as a permeable membrane that lets in specific energy and lets out specific energy, but keeps other energies away and separated. And that also, my boundaries with people can change based on how I'm feeling that day, how they're behaving towards me, my my energy levels, etc. And they don't, because when I first discovered boundaries, it was like, I don't know what my boundaries are. How are you supposed to know what your boundaries are? I guess I'll just make a list of rules for people to follow to engage with me. And that didn't work at all, because it was like, it was not authentic and accurate. And it was more so once I started to develop a much more strong trust of my like physical responses, that I was I was like, okay, here, I'm not okay with this. I don't want to do it.
Mm. Did you experience kind of a lonely period when you started implementing them as things that no longer resonated started to fall off?
Yeah, I did. It was a pretty painful period, especially when I first was like kind of like sober and coming into contact with all of my no's,
Mhm.
because I definitely had a belief at that time that I would never be able to be intimate, because the only way I knew how to protect myself was to completely shut myself out from others. And I also had a lot of beliefs at that time that like I could never be intimate because I had been harmed so many times
Mhm.
at such a young and impressionable age, that like my ability to be intimate in a healthy way was like gone. And that was a really hard time, because I didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel. I only knew that it had become more painful to be intoxicated than it was to deal with the aspects of my life that were uncomfortable. And so I didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel at that point. And it took a good, like, there was definitely like beautiful, positive moments throughout my recovery, but I would say after about 9 to 12 months is when I started to find myself opening up, and like there was just this inherent trust between myself and my body at that point, to where I didn't have to question like, why am I getting bad vibes from this person? Am I crazy? I would just be like, I don't like you. Like, go away. It's not about you, it's about me
Mhm.
and how I take care of myself. So yeah.
Thank you for that. I think it speaks to a lot of people. It's not going to feel comfortable when we're saying no, and when we're letting go of people that have felt comfortable like literally all of our lives, especially if it's something that you picked up from, well, not especially everything was picked up from childhood, but it's when it's coming from there, you can't rewrite 20 years or 30 years or however long in 1 month. So thank you for sharing that. It was a 9 to 12 month process. I think impatience comes out a lot in this healing,
Hmm.
ownership of your life journey, because it doesn't feel good. It feels very uncomfortable. Like you literally, I feel like I'm like speaking to my mirror right now, because I'm just like, so everything you've been talking about resonates so much with my childhood. But no, it was learning to say no was a huge one for me. Learning to say no, and learning to say, it's not my job to save you.
Yeah.
And sometimes I get a high from it. I get this like inner, I'm doing good when I can help people. And I have to realize they didn't ask for my help. You're literally doing this just to make yourself feel better. This is an egoic need right now. It's not even authentically you. So
Mhm.
so beautiful that you can get there. So our path while pursuing our passion is often exciting, and it feels aligned, and it feels amazing. You're like, yes, I found my purpose. But we are met with so many roadblocks, and we often don't talk about these roadblocks. And like one for you, I don't know if you view it like that now, but I view the way that I view our work, and whether you want to call this the work that you do, that you get financially compensated on this 3D planet, or the inner work that you're doing for yourself, or the work that you're doing for the community, I personally believe it's all together. And
Me
in
too.
order for it to be all harmonized, you need to work on yourself so that everything else can flow. So, last year was one of those roadblocks for you. You had to kind of take a step back and work
Yeah.
on yourself. How has your experience been, and could you elaborate on more on how you transitioned out of some of these dark and troubling times? I know you talked a little
Mhm.
bit about last year, but
Yeah.
like even when you were first starting your business, the self-doubt and imposter syndrome that it could have come up, there's a lot of, and I pivoted out of the wellness community. So for me, there was a lot of shadow when I was entering more of like the spiritual. I'm a witch. I'm tapping into all of these things, because when the wellness, it's like, if you do this, this is right. And it's going back to cancel culture. If you do this, this is wrong. And something that I faced was, I'm a cannabis advocate. I love plant medicine. I love it. I love it. I love it. I have so much respect for it. I genuinely feel like it's a part of my, like, each lifetime I've come back and I'm just wanting to work with this medicine. And something I dealt with was, well, you're not a clear enough vessel if you consume cannabis, and you're not a clear enough vessel if you do this. And, you know, it's go do ayahuasca for a week in Peru or Colombia or Costa Rica, but then go back to your regular life, because you're not supposed to be messing with the medicine in your day to day. It's only supposed to be once a
Yeah.
year or twice a year, whatever it is. What?
I mean, in particular, I dealt with like a huge block from the wellness industry, because that was what I got into before I got into, so it was like, all right, I'm like in the music, I'm doing music, I'm a punk artist, I'm playing shows, I'm also descending into alcoholism, remembering all of these like awful childhood traumas, and acting out in ways that were harmful. Once I identified that that was happening, I wanted it to change, and I could clearly see the relationship between the behaviors I wanted to change and my own trauma. I also live with chronic illness. I live with PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is an endocrine disorder, and also something that is not really well supported by the traditional Western medical society or whatever. And my transition from music to being a professional witch, right in the smack middle of that, is when I found the wellness culture and the alternative healing culture. And it was all about healthy eating and not eating sugars, so that my candida would calm down and I would no longer have these endocrine issues. And if I took the right herbs and if I avoided the right foods, I would be able to heal not only my physical illness, but also the manifestations of trauma in my body. And what ended up happening is that I got a horrible eating disorder. And like, I could no longer work at my job, which was at like an alternative wellness store selling supplements. It was really bad. And that was, it was one of those real make or break moments. And that was actually like when I became so ill from my eating disorder and the wellness industry and how I was a part of it, and I had to quit my job. I had also been at that same job. Actually, I met a friend of mine who introduced me to Natal Astrology. Before that, I had only really known about like my sun sign, and I connected so deeply to the system of astrology, and I was playing with tarot cards at this point. And it was like then that I think I really started to actually form a relationship to my intuition. And I transitioned out of that wellness job into soliciting the owner of the local witch shop for a position there, and to mentor with her, which she accepted, because she was like, I asked Spirit to send me a mentor, and so here you are. And so that was like one of the first times that I was in a really dark place, and what I was trying wasn't working, because I drank the fucking Kool-Aid of the wellness industry. Like I was like on board with it, and it stopped working for me. And, you know, I did gain so much out of that. Like I gained a sense of personal autonomy and the notion that I could disagree with doctors. And I still use that, you know what I'm saying? But like the eating disorder shit and like the rampant cultural appropriation that's unchecked, none of that's okay with me. And I had to move on from it. So like I definitely dealt with that. In terms of like, because I think you asked about like specifically like being able to transition out of a dark moment.
Yeah.
For me in my life, and like for me in my life, it's only ever happened because there was no other choice. Like, and I kind of want to say that to others, to kind of let them know, like, it's not something that I just was like, I'm so connected to spirit and like in my authentic alignment that I know that this is no longer for me. It was more so like I was sick and running away from somewhere that I was being traumatized to something that my intuition told me was a bit safer, you know? And the only reason that I made those changes is because I had issues at work where I was getting sick and needing to go to the hospital. And so I'm not saying like you should wait until you have to go to the hospital to make life changes, but I'm saying like if there is a change that you want to make, and especially when it comes to leaving behind an old paradigm that you've identified isn't working for you, because I have dealt with a lot of feelings of like urgency and like I should be changing faster. Don't. Don't, because it's like you said earlier, if you are starting to change in a way that you're not ready for, it's coming from a place of ego,
Mm-hmm.
and it's coming from a place of like, you are not intuitively doing this. You're doing this because you're afraid that you're doing something wrong, and that is only going to lead you to more unaligned behavior, which is going to continue to harm you and others. Because if we're not acting from our intuition, we're not acting with proper boundaries in place.
Can I just say mic drop right there? Because like I feel like, and I'm gonna say this, if you're listening, when you're listening to this, please rewind and listen to that again. Literally listen to that again. I think everyone, and I never like to generalize because everyone has such a different experience, but I think everyone goes through that in some way, shape, or form at some point in their life. And thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think so. I'm speaking now out of term because I the way that I view it is it's almost like the universe is like, yo, you're not listening. This isn't for you. Let me push you. And we get sick, or the relationships that we're in are no longer fulfilling us, or the jobs that we're in are no longer, like, these are literally things that are happening to us, letting us know how out of alignment we are from our authentic self. Now, that doesn't mean that when the messages are coming, we're always there listening. You're literally saying, this wasn't like I was like asking for it. It was more like I was pushed. And I think a lot of that's more of the experience that happens most of the time. What we see on Instagram with, I manifested $1,000 in a week. It's like, they're not sharing all the work and all the shit that went on behind closed doors. So I really want to thank you for sharing that and being so honest with us. I we're coming close to an end, but I want to kind of talk a little bit about alcohol, because you were talking a little bit about that and how you were using that to not deal with what was coming up.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still consume alcohol, or are you sober?
So I am like, I don't know how, but I have made it to a point in my recovery where every so often on like a special occasion, or frankly sometimes, like, I follow a harm reduction model and I always
Mhm.
have. I have never been a proponent of abstinence only sobriety because it's not worked for me. It's not worked for my family member who was very close to dying from alcoholism, who now is not and is in a medication assisted recovery and does consume alcohol from time to time. So for me, like, after I went a full year without drinking any alcohol whatsoever, except for some herbal tinctures from time to time, which I would be like, woo. After a year of that, I was like, I don't feel that I need to be abstinence only. And I think in the last like year, there's been probably like 6 to 12 times that I've had 1 to 2 drinks, although the ones that were more than 1 drink were like a long time ago. Like,
Okay.
I rarely consume more than like half of a serving of alcohol, and I'm not lying. just so you know. Like, I know that sounds kind of unbelievable, because there was a time in my life where I was drinking like a 6-pack every night or finishing a bottle of wine by myself every night. But like, yeah, like on Christmas I had a glass of rosé because my grandmother, my partner's grandmother wanted me to share it with her, and I was like, okay, I can, and I did. And I'll get hungover from half of a glass of wine, and then I won't want anymore. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is because the shit that I was using alcohol to hide from, I dealt with in therapy. And when I say dealt with, I don't mean like I'm done, but the extreme triggers that I have dealt with a lot, to the point where I can handle stress and emotional dysregulation. I'm also on meds, which really helps. So I can handle stress and emotional dysregulation. And I don't use alcohol to numb myself. But like, for me, I know that if I were to tell myself you can never have another drink again until you die, it would just make me obsessed with it, and I would think about it all the time, and I would end up binging, which is the part that really fucks me up, because I get severe anxiety if I binge alcohol, and if I black out, it's really triggering for me. So I don't do that, and I'm really happy about it. And it's pretty controversial. Like, there's one point where I came out about the fact that I'm in recovery and still consume alcohol, and like I had angry messages. But it worked for me. Like, I am sober, and so it's got to work for someone else, so I'm going to talk about it.
No, I think this is actually, I'm so glad that you're bringing this up and that you're open about this. I recently saw Demi Lovato's documentary,
Mm.
and her story, it's very, I relate through a lot of what she shared. So when she was kind of like, I'm California curious, sober, which means I smoke a little bit of pot, I drink a little bit. I wanted to give her a hug and just say, thank you for advocating for yourself and not what society deems is what you should do to be recovered or be
It's the
healed.
same thing that I was just saying. Like, if you're doing something you don't want to do, you're not going to do it.
We're
You know,
not.
you're going to stop doing it.
And I feel like a lot of the times when we're coming from this all or nothing place, it is coming from a wounded little kid, almost like you're telling the little kid, if you do this, I'm going to do this. And I feel like every time you put a little kid in that situation, they're going to push their boundaries. They're going to be like, I'm going to touch the button I'm not supposed to touch, you know?
Yeah.
Because you're not even doing it from a soul place. It's coming off from you're supposed to in order to get this result. And I don't think that's for everyone. I think it's very empowered that you can recognize, look, I was using this in a harmful way. That's not how I am consuming now. And thank you so much. I know someone out there needed to hear that. And I do want to give a disclosure though. Just
Mhm.
because Anna Joy said this works for you does not mean that now you need to go and tell everyone like, well, Anna Joy said that it works for her, so it's going to work for me. Please
Exactly.
take everything we're saying with a grain of salt. Practice this on your own. And if it genuinely works for you, then share your experience. But don't
Yeah.
start running from the rooftop
I mean,
saying,
it's like, exactly, like, if you're someone who, because there are people who are like the opposite of me. They're like, if I say that there's the possibility somewhere in the future to potentially have one drink, then I'm going to be obsessed with it and think about it all the time. So it's not going to work for everyone. It
mm-mm.
really won't. And like, AA does work for people. There are people who have long-term recoveries that they thank AA for, and it didn't work for me, and that's okay. I'm not like going to tell other people that it won't work for them. And also, yeah, like, what works for me may not work for you. You know, if it's just a personal thing, it's a personal experience. And I think, unfortunately, in our society, specifically when it comes to alcohol, I really appreciate Holly Whitaker's work at The Tempest. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but
No.
she really does the research and the historical academia to understand how we came to live in such an alcoholic society to where, because it's not like we just love alcohol, you know, it's being advertised to us. Like some of the most wealthy people in the world, like I think like the top 3 wealthiest people in the world are alcohol, like millionaires from intergenerational alcohol sales. And there's a reason why we're addicted to it on a global level, and it's very hard to fight an addiction once you have it. And I don't think that, and that's one of the reasons why I disagree with abstinence only sobriety. And when it's like, abstinence can be a form of sobriety, but when it's abstinence only, for me it creates this, what's it called, when you're calling someone sick, it's a
victim. You're almost enabling them. I'm trying to
it's
think.
like medicalizing it, or
I know what you're trying to say, but yeah, there's a word for it.
It's basically creating a stigma against people who are addicts and who become addicted to addictive substances, saying like, there's something wrong with you. You can't drink alcohol like everyone else can. So that's why you have to quit, when actually it's just part of our human physiology to become addicted to substances that trigger our pleasure centers in our brain. And that's one thing that did not align with me in AA, is like I would go in there and they would be like, we're different. We're allergic to alcohol. It's a genetic thing that we were born with. And I was just like, I don't think we're that different for being addicted to alcohol. Like, I think we just don't want to be addicted to alcohol. And there's plenty of people who are like not feeling that way. Like they're like, I want to keep drinking alcohol and I don't have a problem with it. And that's actually the difference between quote unquote addicts and people who just like drinking, if that makes sense, like to me. And I'm lucky that I just have really bad anxiety, and I never got to a point where I was like physically dependent, you know, on alcohol. It was more of a psychological thing for me the whole time.
I mean, we all have it though.
Pathologizing.
That's it. I'm like, we all have it, because for me, alcohol was a way to not deal with my emotions. It was a way to distract myself from the present moment. So when I was in high school, I loved it. When someone gave me pot for the first time, I was like, no, this slows me down. I don't want this. Go away. I like things that distract me. And that was something I needed to reevaluate. It's like, when I was 18, when I was 16, I wasn't in a place that I wanted to go inside of myself. I was very much trying to distract myself. When I started to consume cannabis at 27, it wasn't the same thing. It was literally me looking inward and wanting a deeper connection with something bigger. So am I really going to allow a society or a system or an industry that's making a profit out of something off of me to dictate what's right and what's wrong? And when I was able to recognize that, it's like, you have your experience and you have you know, your experience, and this is mine, and let's just share and be okay with that, not coming into different things. I'm going to end this on this, just because you brought it up and I got like a ping from my guides. They're like, ask. You're on medication. If you don't feel comfortable talking about it, it's totally cool. I wasn't even planning on it, but I took medication for a really long time. I'm very big on be your own health advocate. If it's something that you feel like you're needing a little bit of help on, hey, go for it. But I also don't think it's meant to be long-term. Our bodies are not meant to survive on chemicals for extended periods of time. Like at some point, it's more of like a way to invite you to get more, that autonomy that we're all looking for. What was your experience with, because you talked about getting back on medication? Did you deal with a lot of shame and stigma around that?
I did experience a lot of shame around and stigma around medication, to the point where I never even considered medication as an option for me until February 2020. When my guides were like, so you're going to want to get on antidepressants now, don't wait any longer. And then I was like, why? And then I did, and then the fucking pandemic started.
You're like, oh, I get it, thank you.
Because I have always, like, you know, I had a traumatic childhood, and I did not have anyone to talk to about it until I was like 24. So I've always experienced really intense emotional dysregulation. That's my rat, by the way. I'm sorry that
Oh, you're
he's like,
good.
he's making ripping noises.
You're good.
He just has this paper he likes. So I've always dealt with like panic disorder, depression, and specifically like I would get these really intense, like emotional, like episodes that would last for several hours and would take days to recover from, where I would be like crying and just could not calm down. And I was like, well, and that's why I liked getting into wellness, and that's why I wanted to get into witchcraft and understand my intuition, and continue to have a stigma against meds, because I was like, this is my intuition, these are my feelings. But I was like, let me get sober, maybe that will help, I'll stop drinking. And the emotional episodes just continued. Like, they would get better sometimes, but then they would get worse sometimes. And I started to, because I also have the PCOS, so I also am getting like, I get like severe cramps. And the way that my PCOS and my depression and anxiety intersect is that I get really horrible premenstrual dysphoria. And I was sitting there in my premenstrual dysphoria, and I was like, how much of my life am I going to spend like this, like miserable? And I was like, too much. And that was kind of when I decided to try the meds, because I was like, maybe I don't have to feel this way, because I really had this like idea that like I would always feel this way, and it just was like how I am. And then I started the meds, and at first it was great, but then I actually made a dosage error, unfortunately, and I was consuming like way too much of a certain med that was then causing me to have like some hallucinations and paranoid delusions and manic behavior. And I got really scared at that point. And I was also spending time with people who were like super anti-pharmaceutical, loved cannabis, loved psychedelics, did not believe in medicine. It's like in the new age community, there's a lot of people like that. And so, and it was like hard, because it was like the pandemic, I didn't really have anyone to hang out with, and these people were like local and in my pod, and I felt like they were my only friends. And so I was like, I'm gonna get off the meds altogether, because clearly they're not good for me, and I should just be using psychedelics to manage my mental illnesses and trauma. Wow, I'm really being honest right now.
I love
And
it.
what happened was really bad, and it set into motion what I described to you, which is where I was considering quitting being on the internet altogether, because I was experiencing such intense shame and paranoia surrounding my public image and the work that I do, and the potential of me causing harm. And it was after I went through a series of bad trips, honestly, that I was like, fuck this. Because like, I've had great experiences with psychedelics as well, but there was something going on with me, and it was really scaring me. And I will say that everything that I kind of like dug up in this really intense, painful fashion, I was able to work through really, really intentionally in therapy. And I am grateful for that, if that makes sense. Like, there's some things that I don't know if I would have been able to address about myself, honestly, if I wasn't in such a degree of pain. So it's kind of like I was saying earlier, like, I just kind of like fucked up a little bit and was able to access my shadow, but it wasn't necessarily a divine, beautiful, like full of light experience. And so I was in a lot of pain emotionally and physically after, the last of a series of trips that I had. And I was like, I don't care if, I don't care if I have side effects. I don't care if it numbs me to my feelings. I just need to not feel this way. And so I got back on my meds at the proper dose. And ever since then, I've been so happy. And so it's been almost a year since it's been over a year since I first started meds at all, so I'm still pretty new.
Yeah.
I do experience side effects physically, like I have like sore joints, and sometimes I have like short-term memory problems,
Mhm.
but overall they're manageable. And I will actually say that because I am not in a constant state of fight or flight in my nervous system, that has not only improved my physical health, because stress really exacerbates my PCOS, but it also has allowed me to connect more deeply to my intuition and my personal boundaries. Because, you know, like I think alcohol is one thing that was keeping me out of my body, but my panic disorder and shame were definitely another thing that were keeping me out of my body. And the medications that I take, like, just they, like, clearly shame is one of the symptoms of my PTSD, and my medications take it away, and then I can actually be who I am thoughtfully, calmly, and intentionally, rather than responding from a place of like emotional pain.
Wow. Thank you. I'm sure sharing this wasn't easy. There's a lot there. And the first thing that I want to say is you weren't called by psychedelics. It was more of people shaming you for what you were doing. So you were like, I might as well fucking go this route.
Yeah.
So I'm bringing this up because right now, just like Anna Joy brought up, and there's this like new age spirituality culture where it's like psychedelics, cannabis, come to me. If it is not calling you, don't do it because your friends are doing it. Don't do it because a person you follow on Instagram is doing it, because a person that is your mentor is doing it. If it does not resonate with you, you don't have to do it. And I say this as someone that the amount of times that people have said, do ayahuasca, I'm like, she's not calling to me. Leave me alone. When she does, I will be the first person to say, all right, I'm going in.
I'm
Till
sure.
then, not going to happen. Why? Just not in that place. I have so much love for cannabis and psilocybin, and
Yeah,
probably
me too.
will, but there's a time and place. And I will say, like, there's times where I'm microdosing every day, and then I take a step back and I'm just like, why am I doing this? Is this more just because I've been in this automatic state of microdosing, or is it that I really want to connect with my heart energy a little bit more? Cannabis, am I smoking a joint just because I'm around people and everyone's smoking a joint, or is it because I want to connect deeper with the people I'm around? It's asking yourself those questions. And going back to medication, what you said was so freaking pivotal. If you are in a state of flight or flight, you cannot make cognitive and logical decisions. You just can't. If the medication is going to help you get out of the state of flight or flight, please get on fucking medication. Please.
It's
That is the
so
only
good.
way you're going to get to do the fucking healing work. Why? Because you're in a state of flight or fight. I'm like, hey, you want to talk about your childhood? You're going to be like, no, bitch. Why would I want to talk about my childhood? You're not going to do it. So if you have been feeling like you are ready to dive deeper into your trauma, into your inner child, into your shadow, into all of these things, there's some people that didn't have a traumatic childhood. They didn't have a lot to work through. So they might not need that foundation support.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, I needed it for a really long time. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was 18. And there was a moment where I was just like, no more. I don't cry. My friends tell me sad information and I'm just like, okay. And I walk away. I went from over feeling to now being numb. Need to reevaluate that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, and it's
that
all
is,
about temperance. It's like about finding the right balance, because I also had negative experiences with the wrong doses of the wrong meds, and that's why it's also like a very particular experience for everyone.
yeah. So I really wanted to touch on that. I feel like when you're in this spiritual journey, it can sometimes be like, no, you're supposed to do this all holistically. You're supposed to do this with psychedelics. You're supposed to do this. No, there is
No.
no right way. And if someone's telling you you're supposed to do it a certain way, then I'm sure that's advice that they're not taking, because every time you're doing this, 3 fingers are pointed back at you that you're ignoring.
It's really true. And at this point, I've had enough experiences to where if anyone's ever making broad, sweeping generalizations about everyone and how everyone should behave and think, I don't fuck with them at the end of the day, because I don't trust them. Why would I want to form a relationship with someone who's already made conclusions about me, who I am, and what I care about? And I try to do the same for others. I do have a
Oh
meeting
no,
that
I was literally like
but it's
wrapping
best
this up. So thank you. Where can people find you
yeah.
with all your beautiful
So
new
it will kind
offering?
of depend a little bit on when this comes out, because like I said, I'm going to be rebranding. So right now I'm at the Queer Witch and at thequeerwitch.com, but I also am going to be moving towards at Joy Sullivan. That's my full name. Yeah, so you may find me there. You may find me at the Queer Witch, and yeah, and then you can look at my podcast, which is called the Queer Witch Podcast, and it's on all podcasting platforms.
Perfect. I'll definitely show that on the share notes. Well, Anna Joy, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure chatting with you. Cannot wait to see how your journey unfolds in the next few months, and we'll definitely keep touch with you. Have a
Great, thank
wonderful
you
rest
so
of your
much.
day.
You
Bye.
too. Bye.